Russia just brought one of the most dangerous warships ever built back to life. The Admiral Nakhimov, a nuclear-powered heavy missile cruiser, has completed over a decade of modernization and is entering final sea trials. Once operational, it becomes the flagship of Russia's Northern Fleet. And here's what makes this moment significant. This isn't just a repair job. This is a complete reconstruction of one of the most heavily armed surface combatants on the planet. So here's what we're going to figure out together. First, why did Russia spend more than 10 years modernizing a single ship when it's facing resource constraints everywhere else? Second, what exactly changed inside this vessel that makes military analysts so concerned? And third, how does this shift the balance of naval power in the Arctic, and what does it mean for NATO's strategic position? We'll get to all three. But to understand any of it, you need to know one thing about how Russia approaches naval strategy. The Soviets never tried to match the US Navy ship for ship. Instead, they built fewer vessels, but made them so heavily armed that each one could theoretically take on multiple American warships. The Admiral Nakhimov embodies that entire philosophy. The Orlan-class cruisers, called Kirov-Class by NATO, are the largest and most heavily armed non-carrier warships ever constructed. We're talking about a vessel that displaces 25,800 tons, stretches nearly 250 meters in length, and requires a crew of roughly 760 personnel just to operate it. That's not a warship. That's a floating weapons platform. During the Cold War, these ships were designed for one specific mission, confronting American carrier strike groups without needing to build a fleet of aircraft carriers. Soviet designers realized they could pack more firepower into a single massive hull than the US could distribute across multiple smaller vessels. Now, Russia currently has two of these ships, Admiral Nakhimov and Pyotr Veliky, also called Peter the Great. For decades, both sat in various states of disrepair. Admiral Nakhimov was withdrawn from service in 1999. Think about that. The late 1990s. Russia was broke. The Soviet Union had collapsed. The Russian Navy was essentially in free fall. Ships weren't being maintained, crews weren't being trained, and this massive cruiser just sat there. For 14 years, nothing happened. Then in 2013, someone made a decision they were going to rebuild it. The work started at the Sevmash shipyard in Severodvinsk, the same facility that builds Russian nuclear submarines. By 2015, they'd removed massive portions of the original equipment. They inspected the hull, the propulsion systems, everything. Initially, they thought they'd be done by 2018. That didn't happen. The scope kept expanding. New technologies emerged. Russian engineers kept adding capabilities. What was supposed to be a routine overhaul turned into a comprehensive reconstruction. And here's the thing, that actually tells you something important about how Russia thinks about military modernization. They don't retire old platforms, they rebuild them, they upgrade them, they keep them relevant. It's expensive, yes, but it's also strategic. But the real story isn't about the timeline, it's about what they actually changed inside the ship. The original weapon system, the P-700 Granite anti-ship missile launchers, were completely removed. In their place, they installed 10 Universal 3S-14 vertical launch modules. Each module has 8 cells. That's 80 missile cells total, 80 on a single ship. And these aren't just any missiles. The ship can now carry Kalibr cruise missiles for land attack missions, Onyx supersonic anti-ship missiles, and this is the part that matters, Tsirkon hypersonic missiles. Let's pause there because Tsirkon is important. Russian officials claim these weapons can travel at hypersonic speeds, which means faster than Mach 5, while performing complex maneuvers. If that's true, and it's a big if, interception becomes extremely difficult. Traditional air defense systems are designed to track and intercept predictable ballistic trajectories. A hypersonic weapon that can maneuver is a different problem entirely. For a ship carrying 80 of them, the implications are massive. This single vessel becomes a strategic weapon system capable of threatening targets across an entire region. But the offensive capability is only half the story. The other half is defense. The original S-300F Fort air defense system has been replaced by a navalized version of the S-400. This is significant because the S-400 is Russia's most advanced air defense system. The ship can carry up to 96 surface-to-air missiles in vertical launch cells. The long-range 4ON-6 missiles can supposedly engage targets at distances approaching 400 kilometers. That's roughly 250 miles from a single ship. And that's just the primary system. The older Kordik close-range systems have been replaced by Panzer ME. The OSA-M systems are gone, replaced by the Redut Air Defense Complex. What you're looking at is a multi-layered defensive shield. Long-range missiles for distant threats, medium-range systems for closer targets, short-range systems for anything that gets through. It's designed to protect not just the cruiser itself, but any naval task force operating nearby. Now, the nuclear propulsion system hasn't been replaced. It's been extensively upgraded and modernized, but the core reactors remain. That means unlimited range. This ship can operate for months without refueling. It can patrol the Arctic, the Atlantic, or any ocean, and the only constraint is crew, endurance, and supply requirements. For Russia, that's strategically significant. The Arctic is becoming increasingly important. Shipping routes are opening. Resources are becoming accessible. Having a nuclear-powered cruiser that can operate indefinitely in Arctic waters gives Russia a permanent presence in a region where the US and NATO are increasingly active. The electronics have been completely updated. Modern radar systems, advanced fire control computers, integrated combat management systems. The ship can now coordinate with other vessels, aircraft, and shore-based systems in ways the original couldn't. It has helicopter facilities. The Ka-27 M helicopters it carries can conduct anti-submarine warfare, search and rescue, and reconnaissance missions. Everything about this vessel has been modernized to function as a coherent combat system rather than a collection of separate weapons. Here's where it gets strategically interesting. When Admiral Nakhimov completes trials and enters service, attention will shift to Pyotr Veliky. Russia could potentially have 2 of these modernized supercruisers operational simultaneously. That's not a huge fleet, but it's a concentrated amount of firepower. 2 ships, 80 missiles each, advanced air defense, nuclear propulsion, helicopter support. These aren't vessels designed to win a war through numbers. They're designed to project power and make regional conflicts extremely costly for any potential opponent. Now compare this to what the U.S. Navy operates. The guided missile cruisers of the Ticonderoga class carry roughly 90 vertical launch cells, but those cells are distributed across a much smaller ship, roughly 9,600 tons compared to 25,800. The Admiral Nakhimov is physically larger, carries comparable firepower, and has more advanced air defense. It's also nuclear-powered, meaning it doesn't need to refuel. American cruisers need to return to port regularly. From a pure combat capability standpoint, these Russian cruisers are among the most formidable surface combatants in the world. China has been building large destroyers and cruisers, but they're relatively new designs. China doesn't have the decades of experience Russia has with operating massive nuclear-powered warships. The Admiral Nakhimov represents the culmination of 50 years of Soviet and Russian naval engineering. Every system has been tested, refined, and upgraded. That experience matters. But here's the strategic question that actually matters. Why is Russia doing this now? The country is engaged in a grinding war in Ukraine. Naval resources are stretched. Shipbuilding capacity is being consumed by smaller vessels needed for the Black Sea and other theaters. Yet, Russia committed a decade and substantial resources to rebuilding a single cruiser. The answer reveals something about Russian strategic thinking. This ship isn't for Ukraine. It's not for the Mediterranean. It's for the Arctic and for long-term great power competition. Russia is signaling that it intends to remain a major naval power even as the US and NATO increase their Arctic presence. This is a statement of intent. The timing is also notable. The ship is entering trials just as NATO has elevated Arctic operations. Finland and Sweden have joined NATO, extending the alliance's northern border. The US is increasing deployments to the region. Russia's response is to bring its most powerful surface combatant back into service. It's not subtle. It's a direct counter to NATO expansion in the Arctic. When Admiral Nakhimov enters operational service, it becomes the flagship of Russia's northern fleet. That's not a ceremonial position. The flagship coordinates fleet operations, hosts the fleet commander, and serves as the command center for major naval operations. Having a nuclear-powered supercruiser in that role signals that Russia takes Arctic operations seriously. It's a commitment to maintaining a permanent, powerful presence in waters that are becoming increasingly contested. For NATO, this creates a planning problem. The U.S. Navy has capabilities that can defeat the Admiral Nakhimov, but doing so requires commitment of significant resources. A carrier strike group could potentially overwhelm it, but that ties up a carrier that might be needed elsewhere. Regional commanders now have to account for the existence of a single ship that can project enormous firepower across vast distances. That's the entire point of building something like this. It doesn't need to win a war. It just needs to exist and force opponents to plan around it. The broader implication is that Russia, despite economic constraints and military losses in Ukraine, is still investing in long-term strategic capabilities. It's not abandoning its naval ambitions, it's adapting them. The Admiral Nakhimov represents a shift in focus from short-term regional conflicts to long-term great power competition in the Arctic and beyond. That's a strategic choice with implications that extend far beyond a single ship. What happens next is the completion of sea trials, which could take several months. During this period, the ship will be tested extensively. Its weapon systems will be evaluated. Its propulsion will be pushed to its limits. Its sensors and radar will be calibrated. Once that's complete, it enters the Russian Navy's operational inventory. That's when the real strategic impact begins. Russia will have a flagship capable of operating indefinitely in Arctic waters, armed with advanced missiles, protected by multiple air defense layers and equipped with modern electronics. That changes the calculus for any military operation in the region. For the US and NATO, the return of Admiral Nakhimov means Arctic operations just became more complicated. For Russia, it's a statement that despite everything happening elsewhere, it remains committed to maintaining naval power. For everyone else watching, it's a reminder that great power competition isn't pausing, it's evolving. And sometimes the most significant strategic moves happen quietly, in shipyards over years, with a single vessel that nobody talks about until it suddenly matters. The Admiral Nakhimov is now entering trials. In a few months, it will be operational. When that happens, the Arctic becomes a different strategic space. Russia will have the capability to project power across vast distances with concentrated firepower. NATO will have to adjust. It's planning accordingly. And the competition for influence in the Arctic will intensify. This isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of a new chapter in great power competition. And it started with a single ship that spent 10 years being rebuilt in a Russian shipyard. So the question isn't really about the Admiral Nakhimov itself, it's about what it represents. It's about Russia's commitment to remaining a naval power, even as it faces constraints elsewhere. It's about the Arctic becoming increasingly important to global strategy. It's about the ongoing competition between the US, Russia, China, and other powers for influence in regions that were once considered peripheral. The Admiral Nakhimov is just the visible manifestation of that larger strategic reality, and once you see it, you can't unsee it.